All right, Randy DeSoto, please tell us about yourself, man. What you do?
I'm Randy DeSoto. I'm with the Western Journal. I've been with the Western Journal for the last 11 years and write news articles for them and culture and faith, all sorts of things. So I write on these issues. But back in '07, I had put out this book. I went to Regent University and there I wrote a book about the Declaration. Well, I should say I wrote a paper about the Declaration of Independence. And that kind of became the source of a book. But the paper in law school was very, technical, and this book is just a narrative. And so I think what makes it interesting is that I'm a West Point, and give a little more background. I guess I'm a West Point graduate, and then I went to Regent University School of Law and work at the Western Journal. I was in the Army for a while. I was in during the first Persian Gulf War, although I didn't get deployed over there. They only took about half the Army, but I was in tanks and did a lot of stuff that way. And then got out in the early 90s, went to law school and graduated there in 96. And so, yeah, this book, really, I started writing it back in 96. And it took me 11 years, which I thought is kind of appropriate because from the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776, until the Constitution in 1787, it was 11 years. And so I thought, well, I guess that's appropriate. It took me 11 years. Of course, I was working and doing all these other things, working on campaigns. And so anyway, but I finally got the thing out in December of '07. So the same month, 11 years to the month when I started it. And now, almost 20 years later, I thought there's so much that's happened since then, with, and I include like Charlie Kirk in it and with Trump and just a lot of different things that have happened since then. And so I was excited to get it updated, and it just came out last week. Again, there was all these different little things, which I thought was appropriate because Jefferson was writing it this week back 250 years ago, and they presented it, yesterday to the Congress, to the Continental Congress, the Committee of Five, that famous picture with them giving it to John Hancock. And then they debated it a few days and then finally adopted it July 4th with different changes.
Well, how fitting, too, that you're on for our 250th edition episode here. So I think it'll all be perfect, actually. We're glad to have you on, and I'm really interested in the book. I was curious about your take on natural rights. What are our natural rights?
Well, it's interesting in the Declaration, it uses these two phrases, the laws of nature and the laws of nature's God. And so, and of course, going to law school, we had to learn from some of the common law experts from back then, like Koch and Blackstone and some of these people who Jefferson and Lincoln, everybody learned the law from these common law experts from England. And so natural rights are those rights that we can use our reason to discern. Like we shouldn't be killing each other, murdering, there is just war and those sort of things under the rights of, and there's self-defense as far as if you have to kill somebody in self-defense, that's justified. But anyway, so that's one natural right. The right to property, the right to marriage and family and all these things that governments can get in the way of when they become totalitarian, socialist governments and communists and everything else, fascists, they started thinking you don't have any property. But in Blackstone, he explains that because man's reason is not perfect and, people can see things differently, he argues, and the Declaration of Independence argues, that there's also the laws of nature's God, which is scripture. That's what Blackstone tells us. And so like the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness. Those all have corresponding natural rights, right to life, right to liberty, right to not be falsely accused of a crime. So like in our amendments, we have the due process clause, and the reason you have due process is because you want to kind of ferret out, is somebody lying? And like in the Bible, you had to have two witnesses saying, yeah, this guy did this to me and da 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 da. And so they had their own due process way back when. And so we try to do that in our modern culture now with the Constitution, and the different states have adopted that. But that all comes from England too. Even going back to the Magna Carta and before, and the king not having just outright authority, that people have certain inalienable inherent rights.
Gotcha. And so that actually brings something up else that I wanted to talk about is regarding natural rights and other cultures, because there have been a lot of people coming to this country from other cultures who maybe don't have the same God, who don't share the same history as Americans who have been here for a really long time. And then you've got the foreign policy aspect too, with natural rights as it regards to, the Middle East, other parts of the world who don't see natural rights like we do. So given the United States has been the lone superpower for a long time, and we have this, or it feels like a long time to me. It really hasn't been that long in the course of history, but no kidding. And what it is, though, is do we have a moral right to enforce, or a moral duty, I should say, to enforce natural rights across the globe, even on people who don't see natural rights the same way we do? You could take a country like Iran, for example, who their people don't see natural rights like we do. They may see more or less or just completely different. What's our role in the world?
No, yeah, that's interesting. As World War II, and I should say my book, it goes through three major epic defining moments, I argue. So Revolution, Civil War, World War II. And so at the end of World War II, and then I look at today, like with Charlie Kirk things and Trump, and bring it to the current. And I even have John Kennedy on the cover, but N-rated. But at the end of World War II, this is what they were trying to figure out. So you had the Nuremberg trials, which I go through in the book. You had Justice Jackson from our U.S. Supreme Court arguing, he stepped down he took a leave of absence so he could be a chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. And he said, the issue presented to us is, can we hold these leaders and these people like Goering and others accountable, who are the ones that didn't commit suicide, like Goebbels and Hitler and whatever? Can we hold these leaders accountable for the actions that happened in Nazi Germany? Because they weren't breaking their own laws; they were enforcing their laws. Yeah, their laws were to segregate and ultimately kill Jewish people and others deemed undesirable. And he said, yeah, and he actually got back to it. He's like, this trial is based on the faith that there are certain truths that are universal. And, but he quoted Lord Koch, who said, even the king or the government is under God and the law. So actually he had to fall back to the idea of a Christian God broadly. He didn't say Jesus or whatever, but this idea of universal rights, like even like Churchill and FDR and others, when they were referring to what Hitler was doing wrong, they were saying he's acting like the pre-Christian ages. And so that was the issue. So yeah, but then when the United Nations came together, of course it had the best of intentions, but it's interesting. Of course, they didn't mention God or things like that. They just mentioned human rights. And so the United Nations Charter, if you read it, it's got these different, it's the sort of ideals that are in our government, but it's not based on God. So the United Nations was our attempt to enforce these universal truths, and FDR really wanted it. He passed before the United Nations became a thing, but that was his vision. But yeah, that's been the attempt. But you're right. Obviously, throughout history, there have been totalitarian regimes like Iran and others who could care less. I mean, I guess you can go way back to Satan. He was living in heaven and they cast him down. So if there's going to be rebellion in heaven, they can certainly be rebellion on earth. So.
Right. Does the United States have a role to play in going to these countries to liberate these people and bring our idea of natural rights, to the world? I think it was a little more clear of an example, when you're talking about what was happening with, Hitler and Stalin, our opposition to those regimes. But when you're talking about a regime in the Middle East where maybe there aren't a lot of rights, but there's peace. We could use, Jordan as an example, or Saudi Arabia, where they don't see the rights to, property and liberty the same way we do. But do we have an obligation to go free those people and enforce the natural rights as we see fit? Or should we just stay back and say, no, we like our natural rights here in the West, where we acknowledge them and have this shared culture and religion?
Yeah, I know that's the are we the world's policeman question, and obviously we can't do that. Even at the end of World War II, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that Eastern Europe was about to be engulfed by the Soviet Union. They weren't going to allow free elections there, and our leaders had to say, for the sake of peace and just that we can't just be in a perpetual state of war trying to liberate people. We set our boundaries. We said we're going to protect Germany and where we're already and the other Western European nations, but we didn't militarily go into Eastern Europe. We certainly tried to encourage, and Reagan through his rhetoric and whatever tried to encourage the people in Poland who didn't ultimately rise up, and others. And Trump arguably was trying to do the same with Iran. It's like, we want you to be free. But we're kind of in a similar place where we were, say, at the end of World War I or World War II. It's like we don't have the heart or the desire, to enforce these things. We can set an example. We can be a city on the hill, you might say, but we can't. We don't have the resources to be the world's policeman. So the United Nations was set up with that ideal, but it doesn't have a mechanism for doing that either. And of course, it's got many issues, kind of corrupt, a lot of things going on there. But
Yeah, and here in the United States, we just had a couple people in New York that were elected in their Democratic primaries who are going to be congresswomen in the near future, who have espoused that human rights, or what they use as human rights, I would say natural rights. Is there a difference between a human right and a natural right? Could you flesh that out if there is one?
no, I don't know that. I think that's just different language, but no, it
Just the
is
same thing, right?
obvious. Yeah, it's obvious how these things can be twisted around. One person's liberty is another person's vice, and yeah, I mean, in their worldview, it's okay to go out and kill the Jewish people now because they're saying they're occupiers and we need to get them out of here. And of course, the Jews will then say we've been there thousands of years, and the Romans kind of forced them off dispersed them way back when. But so I mean, yeah, each side can claim that they're upholding human rights, but certainly October 7th was not upholding human rights just to go out in there and kill people and take them kidnap. And the Israelis get critiqued for responding too hard. And even Trump said things to that effect. But it's a tough neighborhood, and I don't know, force seems to be the only thing that people understand over there.
Yeah, and that's another interesting point that I've pondered a lot on, is we kind of project a Western idea of collective punishment and morals on this conflict in the between Israel and Gaza right now. And I hear a lot of people will say, hey, well, what Israel's doing is collective punishment. And then we'll also acknowledge, October 7th was, of course, collective punishment as well. They hold the Israeli women and children responsible for, what the IDF does or did 70 years ago. But it's hard to look at it, at that conflict, through a Western lens of, non-aggression, because neither side really has those values. And both sides seem to be on some level okay with a level of collective punishment. So it's hard to look at that conflict, through our lens here in the United States and say, well, collectivism's bad, collective punishment's bad, but both sides seem to get along with it pretty fine. Both sides seem to be willing to engage in that type of contact.
Yeah, and I think Iran has been so much the instigator in all this, and they fund these groups. Israel's been able to make peace, so it's not like there's not an ability to make peace. We've had the Abraham Accords and Egypt, and during the Camp David Accords, and so it's possible that the Arabs and the Israelis can get along, but Iran does not want that, and they are just hell bent on making Israel go away. And so they keep funding these groups that attack Israel, and then Israel responds, and then it's just back and forth. And I think Trump and his team's doing their best to try to find some ground there, but it's tough. I don't know if Hezbollah. The only way Hezbollah will give up is if people stop funding them. It's not like the Israelis they don't want a war with Hezbollah. It's just that Hezbollah keeps firing missiles and, trying to kill their people. And then they feel like they have to respond in such a way to make it very painful. And so it's an ongoing conflict. But yeah, Trump has had some success, of course, in some of these other like decades long conflicts of bringing peace. So where sides seemed intractable. So I guess it's possible in the scheme of things, but it's not easy. Africa, there's been a couple of nations they've gotten peace agreements with, and Pakistan and India and some of these places have dialed it back. And so,
yeah, I'm unfortunately pessimistic about whether we're going to see peace in the Middle East in the next few years, but I hope we do. I really hope that we can at least, protect Americans, if nothing else. But sorry, I led us stray a little bit. That wasn't the direction I had planned on going, but it's such a big topic in the news. I figure, why not? But regarding the congresswomen that were just elected in New York, these and Mamdani is really just another example of this. As mayor, he has a little bit less power to bring about, universal health care and universal, housing as a human right. But you see some of these socialist congressmen and women now espousing that housing is a human right, healthcare is a human right. And how does that play with what the founders had in their idea of, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Is this claim to a human right to housing and healthcare a perversion of what the founders had in mind, or is this kind of the evolution to what they had in mind?
No, well, it's interesting. I am not I liked the way like FDR led during World War II. Like he rallied the country and whatever, but he put out this like Bill of Rights that he called it, where it talked about housing and food and all these things. And, it's kind of utopian in a way. Obviously, I think it's good that we have a safety net. Certainly when people get unemployed through no fault of their own, or they're in kind of a dire situation, we want to help people, and we certainly want to see kids get fed and educated, and we don't want people. We want to house people, to the extent that we can, but we don't want to make it the sort of way that Mamdani is advocating. It's interesting. According to our family tree, I'm a direct descendant of William Bradford, the Plymouth Colony guy. And when you couldn't have found a more idealistic group of people, right? They risked everything. They came over there and they started this new plantation, this new colony in Massachusetts. And the first year or so, they had a collective farm. So, Mamdani talks about the warmth of collectivism versus what did he call it? The rigidity or freezing of individualism, something like that. And, it sounds so nice. Yes, the warmth of collectivism. And so in Plymouth, they tried the warmth of collectivism. And even, in the Bible, there's a little bit of this in certain situations. But what the governor found is that, so they had a collective farming, like, okay, we're all going to work this land and that's what's going to feed us. And they were starving. So they were not getting a lot of harvest. And so he divided all the land up in plots. And he said, okay, this is your land. This is your land. If you farm it, you'll get to eat. And if you don't, you'll starve. Right? And then all of a sudden he said, it was amazing the effect that this had on the people, like people who claimed that they were ill or, had to care for their children or whatever, all of a sudden we're out there working with the kids with them and, to make sure that the harvest got in. And then they solved their food issue. But that was his overall effect. It was amazing to see the effect of people who are lethargic and not really wanting to work. So I think that's the same thing. If you start giving away too much, like I said, I think it's good to have some sort of safety net. That's not a hammock, but that is a help, hand up. You want to try to help people who get in a bad way and enable them to make their way in the world, enable them to fish, so to speak. But you don't want to. The socialism they envision, it tries to give too much away. And like when you start putting a housing rent freeze and stuff, what does that do to investors? The people who own the properties, they don't want to invest more in their property. They don't want to build new properties. So you end up with further shortages. And these sort of schemes have been tried, and then ultimately, so it starts out with this sort of redistribution model, and so the wealthier people start leaving your area, and then it moves on to the acquisition of property by the government, which is what you saw in Venezuela and all of Eastern Europe during, in the Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Nazis, of course, were socialists too. But it does not work in the end because humans are selfish, and if you enable some people are just proud and they want to work and provide their own way. But then when you start taking large portions of their money away, then that disincentivizes them. You wanted people to be rewarded for the work that they do and incentivized to work so that they can provide shelter and food for themselves. So no, I don't, that's not a right. That's certainly not the right that the founders envisioned, which was just, it was the opportunity. Like that, what was that Will Smith movie a while back, The Pursuit of Happiness? That was his conclusion at the end of the movie. That declaration says it's given us this opportunity to pursue happiness. It hasn't guaranteed us happiness or success. We have to achieve that. And yeah, stuff given to you is never as rewarding as when you've earned it.
Well, of course, right. And the line that I've drawn, and if you look at the Bill of Rights, everything in there is the restrictions on the government. They have to let you own firearms. They have to let you peacefully assemble. They have to let you practice your religion. Nothing in the Bill of Rights says the government has to give you something. There is no right to somebody else's labor. Like, you can't just force a doctor to take care of you because, hey, I have a human right to healthcare. Now treat me and shut up. Like, of course, none of that should ever be allowed. And the only way it can be allowed is through government force. And that's why these people try and twist it as a human right, these socialists, because then it justifies the use of force to obtain it. And that's where I think we could draw a really good line is you have the right to life, you have the right to liberty, the pursuit of happiness, property, all that stuff. None of that means I have to work for you for free. So that's just kind of where I draw it.
Well, no, Reagan was so good on this, and we just don't have. Trump is, he's kind of a blunt instrument. Like, he'll say strong things. Reagan was a little more of a persuader, and so he said, when he was, the problem with socialism is that you end up with shared scarcity, and another little Reaganism was a government big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you have, and so there was just so much in the air. Milton Friedman was strong back there in the 70s and 80s, articulating these things, and surprisingly, they had a whole PBS special with him on it, explaining these things, because he was a Nobel Prize winning economist, but he had been a big FDR guy and New Deal and all that stuff. And then he came to see that this is not the way to lift people up.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Reagan was called the great communicator for a reason. I don't think, of all the praise Donald Trump may get after he's gone, I don't think he'll ever be called the great communicator.
No, I think his strength is just fortitude, and he's championed good ideas, and he put through very similar with Congress, similar policies to Reagan on many fronts, and you cannot gainsay his spirit of America, his American spirit. Like, he just wants the country to do well. And that's very Reagan-esque. But yeah, Reagan was an actor and just a Midwest nice guy, and Trump is a New York tough guy. So
yeah. No, literally, like, geographically couldn't have been, farther apart, at least, with Reagan being the governor here of the great state of California and Trump being a hard-nosed New York businessman. But I've got the 10th Amendment here, and I want to read it word for word just so we can, I'd get this thing right. So the 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Has the United States government existed for 250 years now without violating this 10th Amendment? Are they violating it right now? If the founders were here, would they look at our $8 trillion government and say, oh yeah, this is what we had in mind?
Yeah, no, that of course, that was part of the Reagan Revolution too. We were trying to reestablish the 10th Amendment, that the states have boundaries, they have rights, and that the federal government has rights. And those things not specifically articulated in the Constitution are reserved to the states and to the people, is what the 10th Amendment says. And so, yeah, no, I thought one good decision that Trump made during COVID, I mean, there were several, but one was that he said it's a states, we're here to support the states, and the states are going to have to decide because they have the police power. The overarching health, safety and welfare of the people is a state issue. And the federal government is there to protect the nation and, and support the states, but and ensure that there's good cooperation between the states as far as commerce and stuff. But so I thought that was actually good because it allowed each state to kind of figure out what worked best. And it kind of exposed the states that are running amok, like California, and where I used to live. But not during that, thankfully. I was in Arizona, and I'm still here. But yeah, that is a state issue, and so he at least recognized that. If a Democrat had been in charge during COVID, well, we saw some of that during Biden. They would, but Trump had already set the mold. Like the states are the first line of responsibility, and so it was hard for Biden to come in and fix that. But they could have gone exactly the other way and said this is federal, and you're going to do all this. You're not going to get any help or any money or anything. And so, no, I think they're out of balance now, but still functioning in a powerful way. Like that's the difference between, like, say, France or any of these countries is we started out with these 13 colonies all having responsibility and for governing their people. And then ultimately, then they were the states. And then under the Articles of Confederation, kind of a weak federal government. And then ultimately the Constitution rebalanced it. But so I think it's still functioning pretty well. But yeah, obviously there's some areas, some states are running amok, but then that chases people away, like California and Illinois and other states are seeing. And so it kind of balanced itself out a little bit. But
Yeah, COVID was such a good example, and I really struggled with COVID during the first year it was happening, because when Trump was still in office, because I wanted so badly for the federal government, because I live here in California, of course, I wanted the federal government to come out and say no lockdowns, like you're not going to be allowed to violate people's rights. They violated our right to peacefully assemble, to worship. That California just made up all sorts of crazy unconstitutional rules. And I really wanted the federal government to come protect us, but I also understood the federalism part of it, that the states need to be able to take their own different approaches and see what works. Theoretically, they shouldn't be violating our constitutional rights either way, but that's a hard part with, being a Republican, and Trump, I think, struggled with this, was what do I do? Do I stick to my values and say, hey, small federal government, let the states do what they want? Or do I come in and protect people's constitutional rights? And that was a really tough balance to strike during COVID, unlike anything we had seen in a long time.
I got to interview Cheon with that Harvest Christian Fellowship, and he sued Gavin Newsom because the local officials were trying to put him in jail and charge any of his congregants like $1,000 or something every service they attended. And so he sued, and he made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And he got the sort of decision. This is where, like, you're right, the California had infringed on our rights recognized under the U.S. Constitution to freely worship. And so then the federal government did ultimately step in, and then California stepped back. But I mean, it was getting towards the end of the pandemic at that point. But yeah, so it took a while to get that ruling because the local courts all were siding with the federal state law. And then finally the Supreme Court stepped in and they're like, no, this is wrong. Yeah, there's a freedom of religion. If they can gather, that was the whole outcome of the case. If you can gather wherever, you have to be able to gather, and even going to stores and things like that. I think they were even able to go to like porn places or whatever, but you can't go to church. And so they're like, no, it doesn't work that way. So and then Cheon, they got like a settlement, a pretty significant settlement too. And
we have the right to peacefully assemble even when there's a bad cold going around. I don't think there's an exemption for that the government just gets to violate our rights whenever, they think that the the flu is a little extra tough.
And selectively enforced it too. When these sort of, riots or demonstrations are going on. So no, that's First Amendment. And then when churches want to gather, even outdoors for a while, they made it a big issue. No, you can't do that. That's like,
That was one of the most infuriating parts of COVID is when they came out and said, no, racism is a bigger public health crisis than COVID. So these BLM gatherings, those are fine, but you can't go to church. That was probably the most infuriating part.
yeah. So yeah, I was interviewing California pastors during all that. And so it was interesting. A lot of them were adapting by having outdoor services, but I think even then there were limits about how many people you could bring and, that sort of thing. So.
Mm-hmm. And did you interview Charlie Kirk?
Did I interview who?
Charlie Kirk.
I did interview. I was looking back through my old emails. In the book, I quote from an interview I did with him on socialism. And I attended the Dream City. They would have Turning Point faith events at Dream City Church. So I'd go to those too. And they'd have like speakers like Eric Metaxas and others coming in. And so I report on some of that in the book as well. And so it looks like my first interview with him I was just looking at my emails the other day, was way back in like 2016. He was at CPAC and I was at CPAC, and I'd set up to interview him there. They were just kind of getting Turning Point going. So they had all these signs in back of them. And I talk about this in the book, socialism sucks and big government sucks. And so that was their kind of catchphrase back then. And like I said, the organization was only a few years old at that point and still, had a lot of growing to do as far as the impact it would ultimately have. And I mean, they were doing good things back then too. But I interviewed him.
What was Charlie like?
He always struck me as kind of when I first met him, of course, he was just like in his early mid-20s at that point. Probably like 22 or something. I was just like, this guy has got a lot of confidence. And he's very direct. That was the other thing that struck me. Like, he's as he kind of comes across on the stage too. He just kind of he was just very much taking care of business, but friendly. He wasn't a mean person or anything like that. But the last time I interviewed him full on, I guess, was 2020. So during COVID. Well, no, it was right before COVID. And it was about socialism. A survey had just come out showing that 7 in 10 Democrats would be inclined to vote for Democrat socialists. So even then it was going that direction. And so I asked him we talked about that for our, we had a nice little interview. It was just a phone interview that I, transcribed. I made it into an article at the time with the Western Journal. And then I pulled from that article and listened to the interview again for the book and added some new things in the book that weren't in the article. But
Gotcha. Yeah, I never had the pleasure of meeting Charlie. We almost got to a college organization I was a part of, wanting to have him come speak, but we couldn't afford the security and everything. And so then we figured at the time we would go with somebody else who maybe wouldn't be as big of a security concern. So we went with Milo Yiannopoulos.
Oh, yeah.
As you could imagine, that ended up even worse.
Pretty big. I thought you were going to say Ben Shapiro but no, that would do it too. But yeah, I saw that the last text I ever traded with him was in 2024. I went to a Dream City Church event and they talked. He had done this book, or they had produced this movie called Letter to the American Church, which was about Eric Metaxas's book. And so they were talking about socialism. And he had a great phrase, Charlie did. He said, Christianity is like kryptonite to socialism because socialism is based on selfishness and envy and the sort of things that Christianity tries to, camp down and for, get people to not give into. To be more, not, it says love others as you love yourself. It's not that you don't love yourself, but, love others too. But, so anyway, it was a really fun night. And so I sent him an article I'd written and he shot a little text back saying, thank you. And so that was the last communication I had with him.
Yeah, man, it's crazy to look back on that, but I love that quote that Christianity's the kryptonite of socialism. I'd heard that before and even expounded upon with, the context that Christianity, cannot exist in a socialist system. The socialists have to destroy Christianity because it's a power higher than the state. And so you can't have people who go to church and worship God and are thankful for, all the things that God gives us, because then that undermines the authority of the state, and the state just can't, the socialist communist state can't exist alongside the church. Those two things aren't going to exist. That's why the USSR had to, ban Christianity and did all the horrific atrocities they committed against the clergy. Those were, when the Bolsheviks first took over, the clergy were some of the victims of the worst crimes that were committed there by the Red Army, and eventually what would become the Red Army, the Cheka as well. It's all just a really interesting take on how Christianity can inoculate us against these really bad ideologies. And then I just get even more cynical. That's why they're trying to undermine the church. That's why Gavin Newsom doesn't want you going to church during COVID, because the state is going to be the authority now. Now, how do you feel about all that?
No, as you were talking, I was thinking in the World War II section of the book, I have a whole chapter on Frank Capra, and he was so good on this. Like he was saying, he wrote Prelude to War was the first documentary. So he had gotten back into the army. So he'd been in the army during World War I, and then he got back in during World War II. He was a major at that point in his 40s, I think, and so George Marshall, who was in charge of the army, said, "I need you to make documentary films that explain why we fight." And so that was the title of the documentary series. And so that first one was so strong on this point of the whole point of the Nazi government going after the church was that they wanted to take away any moderating influence that the church had or any higher authority. And they even have a quote in the documentary saying, in Germany, Adolf Hitler is like the voice of God, and he's far more important than what Jesus had to say. da, 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 da. And so, and of course, Bonhoeffer, he was killed because there were good church Christian people at that time, but a lot of the church just kind of joined in with the socialists, the established church, and so that was regrettable. But there were a lot of good Christians at the time. But no, you're right that the idea that the state, in a totalitarian government, the state has to be God, and it has to be the divvier of rights. And in a free country, Christianity creates that bulwark against tyranny by saying, no, there are certain divine laws that not even any government can contravene justly. And if you have enough Christians who believe that, or enough people who are even of that mindset, they don't have to be Christians, but just kind of accept, yeah, this is true, then you have a bulwark against tyranny. But if not, yeah, the road has been paved towards tyranny, and the less Christian influence, the more totalitarianism creeps in.
Yeah, you can't have the totalitarianism along with this idea of natural rights that are given by God.
No.
You have to, if you stamp out God, then you can stamp out the natural rights, and then the road to tyranny is paved, just like you said. No, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, all things are possible at that point. There's no right and wrong. Well, that's what I'd argue too, is that the church is there. People talk about church and state. The church is there just to provide the higher moral laws to teach on these sort of things. And if the government becomes part of the church, like say in England or wherever, that tends to corrupt the church, because then they're obedient to what the government wants. If they're the ones supporting them through the taxes and this, that, and the other thing, then it's not doing what the church should do. And so it actually ends up corrupting both. The church no longer has true Christians leading it. It just has political people. And then the government is not held to a higher authority. So.
Completely true. No, that's it. As we're coming up on the end here, is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have?
No, I'm just excited. Like I said, I put out this book in 2007, and I'm just excited. I just thought, boy, with this anniversary, I've got to get another version of this up. And so much had happened since then. And I, it's not that it's a major part of the book, but I tried to pay tribute to Charlie Kirk, both in the foreword and in the last chapter of the book. Actually, I have a pretty big discussion about how do you change culture. And I used him as an example, and others, but I used primarily him to talk about, they call it the 7 mountains of cultural influence, where your religion, government, media, arts and entertainment, etc., business. So, you have to influence all those mountains or spheres of influence, if you want to call them, if you want to change a culture. And Charlie Kirk was changing the culture so others have to step in now and continue that work. But, so yeah, but not just that. I've learned so much in the last 11 years of being a journalist how to better tell a story. So I think I've really put together something special here. So this is it right here. And I've got
Where can they find that?
in the back of it. But yeah, it's on Amazon, and I'm excited to tell.
Awesome. Sweet. Do you have any social medias where people can go find you?
Yeah, I'm on X, at Randy DeSoto, and I'm on True Social at Randy DeSoto also. And then, of course, I have an Instagram account, but I just post little pictures from Arizona mostly there. So if you want to see pretty pictures from Arizona, or when I traveled to other states, but it's a lot of Arizona there. But that's
Oh yeah. So then I got to ask you, and then they can find you at the Western Journal too, right? Lots of articles there.
What did you say? I'm sorry, what did you?
The Western Journal, they can find you and a lot of the writings you've done there, right? The Western Journal.
Yeah, and I share, whenever like I did an article today. So whenever I try to do as many articles as I can, but while during this book release, I'm trying, sometimes I can just get one article out or something like that. But yeah, on my X account, you'll see them, I share them on my X account along with other things, but you'll find all my recent articles there at Randy DeSoto on X.
And since you're a big nature guy, what's the best national park you've been to?
Oh, let's see. I I've gone to Yosemite many years ago, and that was pretty. And Lassen is actually a pretty park up near Redding. The Grand Canyon is just so overwhelming that I guess I have to say Zion. I have some awesome pictures from Zion. I was there a few months ago, and I was at the Overlook. That is a really pretty place. And Bryce, if you get to that kind of lower part of Utah there, that southern part of Utah, you've got some prime country. Big Bend's there in Arizona, the Big Bend or whatever they call it. That's pretty. And that's not a national park though. That's just run by a local group, but I think it's native.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's native or not, but.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Lassen National Park because I don't think a lot of people have heard of that one, but I will be there in 3 weeks. So, and I've been many times. It's a great national park.
And Burney Falls is up that way too. That's not, I think that is a state park. That is so pretty. You can't ask for a prettier waterfall than that.
Burney's great. I've also been there before. Burney Falls is a great one. That's like a deep cut. There really aren't a lot of people that have been to Burney Falls.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in Northern California, so. And then that drive you go from Redding to Reno or whatever. If you drive over that way from Redding and then you go on the eastern side of the Sierras, especially depending on after like the winter before it gets too dry in the late summer, fall, that's some of the prettiest country you'll ever see in your life.
Heck yeah, it is. And not a lot of people out there. You'll have it all to yourself too.
Yeah, no.
That's good stuff. Okay. Well, thanks, Randy. I appreciate you coming on, man.
Thank you, Derek. Thanks.
Have a good one.
You too.